To the Mark Prater podcast, where our aim is to connect our global family of Sovereign Grace churches with our executive director. It's the new year. We haven't been canceled yet.
Happy New Year, Ben. I can't believe we haven't been canceled yet.
We continue to plod along in this podcast.
Yep.
Actually, though, and at the danger of shifting our listeners, our readers, to a different podcast, which is probably going to happen after this is read or watched. You wanted to talk about another podcast. It's been mentioned before, but I think a lot of people aren't really familiar with. There's another Sovereign Grace podcast. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I'm going to take the bold move of losing more followers of this podcast, which aren't a lot of followers, so it's not that bold of a move. But the bold move of promoting another podcast, and I hope people who listen to this podcast will benefit from it, and that is the Ordinary Pastor Podcast. That title, Ordinary Pastor Podcast, actually has some history in Sovereign Grace. It was a podcast started several years ago that Mickey Connolly and C.J. Mahaney and Jeff Purswell did for a number of years. They just talked about just a various number of topics that served our pastors, and they took a break from that. Really, I think around the pandemic, if I remember right, and since then decided, hey, let's let some younger guys do it. And so John Payne and Jared Mellinger, both members of the leadership team, and John, who's a director of our church development, and Jared, who really oversees our publishing, including the Sovereign Grace Journal, they're doing the podcast. John is the senior pastor of Redemption Hill Church in Round Rock, Texas. That's in the Austin area. And Jared is the senior pastor of Covenant Fellowship Church in Glen Mills, Pennsylvania, where I happen to be a pastor as well. And so when these guys talked about doing a podcast together, they just thought, let's just keep the Ordinary Pastor Podcast title, which I think is appropriate because I think that's how we view ourselves as pastors in Sovereign Grace. We're just ordinary pastors who are desperate each and every day for the grace of God and the power of the Spirit to fulfill the ministry that God has given us in leading and pastoring and caring for our churches. So it's a podcast that those guys host. They have just a number of topics that they plan to talk about. And I really want to encourage anyone listening or reading this podcast to subscribe to the Ordinary Pastor Podcast. You can do that on the SGC Pastors website. I'm sure it's on Apple and Spotify and common places where you would find podcasts anyway. And give it a listen. I think you'll really benefit from it.
Yeah. So why do you want us to listen to the Ordinary Podcast?
Yeah, these guys have just started out really, I think, out of the gate running strong with this podcast. What they did, they devoted the first several episodes to our shaping virtues. In fact, the first episode, they talked about just why did we create these shaping virtues, which are really not unique to Sovereign Grace. They are the work of the gospel, the fruit of the gospel in our lives. And then they dedicated a podcast to each of our 7 shaping virtues, and then dedicated a podcast to resources that anyone, members of our churches, pastors, those that are not a part of Sovereign Grace, could read just to grow in those areas, in each of those virtues that are mentioned. Their most recent podcast, John did an interview with Jeff Purswell regarding that word evangelist, the phrase that you find in the pastoral epistles for pastors to do the work of an evangelist. And Jeff does a great job of just unpacking what that phrase evangelist means and what that means for people, members of our churches, but pastors in particular. So I'd encourage you to check out that particular episode as well. So there's just a number of topics these guys have planned. John told me just a couple of days ago that they've got 3 or 4 more episodes already recorded and are about to drop. He didn't tell me the topics, which I'm glad he didn't, because I hope it piques your curiosity to listen to the Ordinary Pastor Podcast.
Yeah, I have been listening to it. I've been enjoying it. I've been benefiting from it. I mean, if people aren't aware of that this podcast has been around, even going back into the first season, will benefit you when it comes to topics and discussions about planning Sunday meetings and sermon preparation with CJ and Jeff and Mickey, and those are wonderful. But John and Jared doing a great job putting in work and serving us. And so thank you guys for that podcast. And may the best podcast win. Apparently, we're now we have competition.
It's a battle of podcasts, right?
That's right. I think we're going to lose.
I do too.
We're not canceled, and we plod. And so we're grateful for everyone who reads this podcast or who watches it. Thanks for your support. Hope we're serving you, and we're grateful for how we're being served by the Ordinary Pastor podcast. So thank you, Mark, and thank you for reading or watching. We'll see you here next week. Lord willing, bye for now.
Thank you for watching. If you have questions or comments, Mark would love to hear from you. For more videos like this, hit subscribe on YouTube or by email at markkprater.com.